Imagine a city that glitters like a jewel in the heart of the arid steppe. In the early 13th century, Samarkand was not merely a metropolis, it was the beating heart of the Silk Road, a place where the dust of the desert met the fragrance of Persian gardens. It was the crown jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, a civilization that believed itself to be the pinnacle of Islamic culture and military might. Its walls were thick, its citadels reached for the heavens, and its population lived in a haze of prosperity, surrounded by the finest scholars, artisans, and poets of the age. But in the spring of 1220, the air in Samarkand changed. The scent of jasmine and spices was replaced by the metallic tang of fear. On the horizon, a darkness was gathering, a storm composed not of wind and rain, but of hoofbeats and iron. The Mongols were coming. To understand the sheer scale of the tragedy that was about to befall this city, and specifically the horrific fate awaiting its most vulnerable inhabitants, one must first understand the collision of worlds that precipitated it. This was not a random raid. This was the result of a calculated, methodical annihilation brought about by a diplomatic insult that would reshape the history of the world. Genghis Khan, the unifier of the Mongol tribes, had initially sought trade, not war, with the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II. The Mongol leader famously sent a message stating that while he was the master of the lands of the rising sun, the Shah was the master of the lands of the setting sun, and that peace and commerce should flow between them. However, history turns on the hinges of arrogance. The Shah, viewing the Mongols as mere barbarians unworthy of equal standing, allowed, or perhaps ordered, the governor of Otrar to seize a Mongol trade caravan and execute its envoys. It was a fatal miscalculation. For the Mongols, the person of an ambassador was sacrosanct. By killing them, the Khwarezmian Empire had not just started a war, they had invited an apocalypse. Genghis Khan went to the top of a sacred mountain, bared his head to the sky, and prayed for 3 days and nights. When he descended, his objective was no longer trade. It was total erasure. The army that marched toward Samarkand was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. It was a machine of war, disciplined, mobile, and terrifyingly efficient. While the Khwarezmian forces were vast, numbering perhaps nearly 500,000 men across the empire, they were scattered, defending individual cities. The Shah, fearful of his own commanders and their tribal loyalties, refused to concentrate his army. He believed his fortified cities, with Samarkand as the strongest among them, could withstand any siege. He believed the Mongols, with their light cavalry and lack of heavy siege equipment, would break their teeth against the walls of his capital. He was wrong. The Mongols brought with them Chinese engineers, experts in the art of dismantling stone and mortar. They brought catapults, trebuchets, and gunpowder bombs. But their most potent weapon was psychological. As they swept through the empire, obliterating the city of Otrar and then Bukhara, they cultivated a reputation for absolute terror. In Bukhara, Genghis Khan had gathered the survivors in the Great Mosque and declared himself the flail of God, sent to punish them for their sins. He made it known that resistance meant death, while submission might, only might, offer a chance at survival. News of the fall of Bukhara reached Samarkand before the first Mongol horsemen appeared on the horizon. The refugees brought tales of horror that seemed impossible to comprehend. They spoke of pyramids of severed heads, of fields slick with blood, and of a silence that fell over bustling cities. The panic within. Samarkand began to fester. The city was defended by a massive garrison, estimated by some chroniclers to be over 100,000 strong, including war elephants and elite Turkic mercenaries. On paper, Samarkand was impregnable. In reality, its morale was already shattered. Babiyar. When the Mongol vanguard finally arrived, they did not attack immediately. They surrounded the city, cutting off all avenues of escape. The siege began with a suffocating silence. The citizens of Samarkand looked out from their ramparts and saw an ocean of tents stretching as far as the eye could see. They saw the smoke of campfire rising into the twilight, a visual reminder that the world outside their walls now belonged to the Khan. The initial skirmishes were brutal. The defenders of Samarkand, desperate to break the stranglehold, launched sorties from the gates. They fought with the desperation of men protecting their homes, but they were met by the feigned retreats and deadly archery of the Mongol horsemen. The defenders were drawn out, encircled, and slaughtered. The Mongols played with them, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses, And all the while, the psychological pressure mounted. On the third day of the siege, the cracks in Samarkand's resolve shattered completely. The garrison, specifically the Turkic mercenaries who shared a cultural affinity with the Mongols, believed they could cut a deal. They thought that by betraying the Shah and the city, they would be spared. They opened the gates. It was the final nail in the coffin of the city. The mercenaries rode out, expecting to be welcomed as new allies. Instead, Genghis Khan ordered them all executed. To the Mongol code of loyalty, a man who betrayed his master would eventually betray his new one. Their bodies were left to rot in the sun, a grim message to the citizens still trapped inside. With the outer defenses breached and the garrison liquidated, the city lay open. The civilian population, along with the remnants of the loyalist soldiers, retreated to the inner citadel, but hope was gone. The imam and the leading scholars of the city went to Genghis Khan to negotiate a surrender, hoping to save the lives of the populace. They were granted safety for themselves and their families, but for the rest of the city, the nightmare was just beginning. The Mongols entered Samarkand not as conquerors, but as executioners. The population was ordered to gather in the great plains outside the city walls. Imagine the scene: hundreds of thousands of people, stripping themselves of their dignity, clutching their children, walking out of their homes under the gaze of the mounted warriors. They were told to leave their possessions behind, that everything now belonged to the Khan. This is where the true horror of the historical record comes into sharp focus. The Mongols were meticulous. This was not a chaotic riot, it was a bureaucratic dismantling of a society. The men of fighting age were separated first. Any who had offered resistance, and many who had not, were put to the sword immediately. The accounts describe a systematic culling, where the streets ran red and the air was thick with the copper scent of blood. But the fate of the women, particularly the women of the royal court, and the upper nobility, was a tragedy of a different, more prolonged nature. The title of Royal Virgin in the context of the Khwarezmian court referred not just to the daughters of the Shah, but to the vast network of aristocracy that supported the empire. These were women of high birth, educated, raised in the seclusion of palaces, adorned in silk and gold, symbols of the empire's cultural refinement. Chronicles from the era, including the writings of Persian historian Juvaini, speak of the sheer magnitude of the captives. The number often cited, 70,000, is staggering. While medieval numbers are frequently exaggerated for effect, even a fraction of this figure represents a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions. These women were not merely killed, they were commodified. In the Mongol worldview of the 13th century, the population of a conquered city was a resource to be distributed. The women of Samarkand were rounded up and sorted like livestock. The young, the beautiful, and the high-born were prized above all else. They were the spoils of war, destined to be distributed among the Mongol commanders and the soldiers who had campaigned for thousands of miles across the steppe. For the women of the Samarkand nobility, this was a descent into a hell they could not have conceived of in their worst nightmares. One day, they were the protected elite of an Islamic empire. The next, they were the property of warriors who despised their culture and viewed them as trophies. The accounts describe the wailing that rose from the captive camps, a sound so piercing it was said to haunt the soldiers who heard it for the rest of their days. The royal virgins, the daughters of governors, generals, and the Shah's extended family, were singled out for the highest-ranking Mongols. This was a deliberate act of humiliation and domination. By taking the women of the ruling class, Genghis Khan was systematically erasing the Khwarezmian lineage. He was ensuring that the bloodline of his enemy would effectively cease to exist as an independent entity, absorbed instead into the Mongol genetic pool. The brutality inflicted upon these women was terrifying beyond words. They were subjected to mass rape, a common and horrific tool of war used to terrorize and subjugate. But beyond the immediate violence, there was the terror of displacement. These women were not kept in Samarkand. The city was being emptied. They were tied together and forced to march. Imagine the journey that followed. These 70,000 women, stripped of their finery, many barefoot, were forced to walk the long, grueling road back to Mongolia. They were driven across the deserts and the mountains, through the freezing cold of the Pamirs and the scorching heat of the Gobi. They became beasts of burden, carrying the looted treasures of their own city. Many died along the way, their bodies left to mark the path of the Mongol return. Those who survived the journey faced a life of slavery in the camps of the steppe, thousands of miles from the gardens of Samarkand. The psychological impact of this event on the Islamic world cannot be overstated. The chroniclers of the time wrote of it with a sense of apocalyptic despair. Ibn al-Athir, a contemporary historian, wrote that he hesitated to even record these events, for he wished he had never been born to see them. He described the treatment of the women of Samarkand as a violation of the very order of the universe. To the medieval mind, the fall of such high-born women to barbarians was a sign that God had abandoned them. The terror was not just in the act itself, but in the totality of it. The Mongols did not just defeat an army, they dismantled the biological and cultural future of the city. By taking 70,000 young women, they stole the next generation. Samarkand was left a ghost town. The intricate irrigation canals that fed the gardens were destroyed or neglected, turning the paradise back into dust. The libraries were burned, the mosques desecrated, and the silence that fell over the ruins was the silence of a grave. We must also consider the fate of the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, the man whose arrogance had invited this doom. He fled before the city fell, chased across his own empire by a detachment of Mongol hunting dogs, Generals Jibi and Subutai. He died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, destitute and broken, hearing the news of his city's burning and his family being enslaved. The women of his court, the very women he was sworn to protect, were distributed among the sons of Genghis Khan. It is said that some of the royal princesses were forced to serve at the tables of the Mongol queens during victory banquets, a final, crushing display of power. The specificity of the 70,000 figure serves as a grim marker in history. Even if we account for inflation by terrified scribes, the reality remains that the female population of one of the world's greatest cities was effectively kidnapped and erased. This mass abduction changed the demographics of Central Asia. It introduced Persian and Turkic bloodlines into the Mongol tribes, and it spread the culture of the Khwarezmians into the east, but at a cost of unspeakable suffering. The story of the Samarkand virgins is also a testament to the Mongol method of warfare. Terror was their most efficient weapon. By treating the royal women of Samarkand with such absolute ruthlessness, Genghis Khan sent a message to the rest of the world. When the Mongols later marched on Russia, on Baghdad, on Europe, the stories of Samarkand preceded them. The fear that their own wives and daughters would suffer the fate of the Samarkand women caused many cities to surrender without a fight. The suffering of those 70,000 women became a weapon used to conquer millions more. As we look back at this event from the safety of the modern world, it is difficult to bridge the gap of empathy. The numbers are too large, the time too distant. But we must try to individualize the horror. We must think of the individual woman, perhaps a musician or a poet, raised in the shadow of the turquoise domes, who watched her father die, her city burn, and was then dragged into a life of servitude on the harsh steppes. Her voice was silenced, her story lost to the wind, surviving only as a statistic in a dusty chronicle. The sack of Samarkand in 1220 stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was a moment when civilization was brought to its knees by the sheer force of violence. The terrifying beyond words aspect lies not just in the violence, but in the finality of it. A culture that had taken centuries to build was dismantled in days. The beauty of the royal court was dragged into the mud. In the aftermath, Samarkand would eventually rise again. Decades later, under the Pax Mongolica and later under the rule of Timur, it would return to glory. But it was a different city, built on the bones of the old. The genetic and cultural memory of the massacre remained. The ghosts of the 70,000 women haunted the collective consciousness of the region for centuries. The legacy of this event challenges us to confront the brutal reality of empire building. We often look at the Mongol Empire with a sense of awe at its size and the speed of its conquest. We admire the military genius of Genghis Khan. But the story of Samarkand forces us to look at the cost. It forces us to acknowledge that the great maps of history are drawn in blood, and that the consolidation of power often comes at the expense of the most vulnerable. The tragedy of the royal virgins of Samarkand is a reminder of the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that art, culture, and refinement are no shield against the sword. When the social contract breaks, when war becomes total, humanity is capable of descending into an abyss of cruelty that defies description. As the sun set over the ruined walls of Samarkand in the winter of 1220, the city was silent. The men were dead. The women were gone. The pearl of the East had been hollowed out, leaving only a shell. The wind blowing from the steppe carried no scent of spices, only the ash of burnt libraries and the echoing memory of a terror that changed the world forever. This was the price of the Mongol wrath. This was the fate of Samarkand. And it remains a warning from history that echoes down through the ages, a testament to the terrifying capacity of man to destroy what he has built and to consume the innocent in the fires of ambition. To analyze the siege of Samarkand is to peel back the layers of a historical trauma that reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Eurasia. We must recognize that the chroniclers who wrote of 70,000 virgins were using the language of their time to express an unspeakable loss. In their eyes, the violation of these women was the violation of the soul of Islam itself. It was the end of an era, a rupture in the timeline that could never be healed. Even today, in the archaeological strata of Rasiab, the ancient site of pre-Mongol Samarkand, evidence of the destruction can be found. Layers of charcoal and debris tell the physical story, but the human story is found in the silence of the records that follow. For a generation, the cultural output of the region ceased. The poets were silent, the looms were empty, the mothers of the next generation were gone, raising the children of their conquerors in yurts made of felt, singing lullabies in a language their masters did not understand, preserving fragments of a lost world in the whispers shared between slaves. This is the true weight of the story. It is not just about the moment of the sack, but the long, agonizing aftermath. It is about the survival of the human spirit under conditions of absolute subjugation. While the title focuses on the terror, and rightly so, the endurance of the survivors is the unwritten sequel. These women, though enslaved and displaced, carried the seeds of Persian culture into the Mongol court. Over time, the Mongols themselves would be transformed, adopting the religion, the bureaucracy, and the culture of the people they had conquered. In a strange twist of irony, the civilization of Samarkand eventually conquered the Mongols from within, but it was a victory bought with the tears and lives of the 70,000 who walked the road of sorrow in 1220. So, when we speak of the Mongol Horde and the terrifying fate of the Samarkand nobility, let us remember it not as a distant myth, but as a visceral reality. It is a story of power, hubris, and the devastating cost of war. It is a story that demands to be told with gravity and respect, a memorial in words for those who have no grave. It stands as a dark monument to the year the world broke, and the terrifying silence that followed the fall of the Golden City.